Okay. Well, so tell me what it was like, what the hospital was like, and you can start that with by telling us the name of the hospital and what it was like to have a baby then.
Okay, now just let me get my thoughts collected here a minute. All of you children were born at the Calgary General Hospital. I had Dr. Doug Buchanan, obstetrician. He was an intern when I was training for a nurse, so I knew him fairly well. Giving birth to a child in the 50s and 60s was entirely different than I don't think it's different than now, but the method of preparation and the length of stay in hospital and so on is different. The prenatal classes were just for the mother. The fathers weren't involved in that at all. You were taught more or less the same type of relaxation methods and so on that mothers are taught now, but as I say, the fathers weren't at all involved in the actual preparation for birth. I always waited until I was absolutely sure that the baby was on the way before we went, because I did not want to go to the hospital and then walk up and down the corridors and pain stop and home you come. So I perhaps left it almost too long for a few of them, but I think John, I never had a very long time in hospital waiting for the birth. It was maybe the longest I was ever there was 2 hours. Then the babies were whisked away. You didn't have them in your room, and in a bassinet, and I would have liked that, I think, and yet on the other hand, perhaps you got a little more rest without the baby right there. But I was in the hospital on average of 5 days, 5 to 6 days. That was the average for anybody after delivery. I think probably the methods are much, much better now. It was quite cold and sterile type of an atmosphere in the delivery room. It didn't bother me because I knew what it was all about, but I know it must have surely bothered lots of young mothers that knew nothing about what hospitals are all about. Got the baby regularly about every 4 hours to feed, and then they were taken away again, so you didn't have them right there with you. Visiting hours were very restricted. You just, the husband and parent, your parents could come. Children weren't allowed. I remember being in, especially when Cam was born, the room I was in was on the ground floor, and Jack and my mom brought John to the window for me to look out and say hello to him. And basically, that's about all, I guess. That's just has changed from now.
Mm-hmm. Okay. When did you lead into that, Dad? What sort of things changed in just household organization, family organization, as you had more kids, more things to take care of, and what did you? Everybody was getting a little older, or John and Cam were getting a little older, and so you looked at holidays and whatnot.
And the fact that, well, as the time went on, though, you were away, especially in the winter. Yes, you were away more and more through the winter, and because that was when I was always very glad to have Mom here, because it would have been quite hectic at times, because you used to go north and be there quite. And then once the kids were in school, well, then we were involved in things at the school, and then on into Cubs and Scouts and all that kind of thing, you know. Sunday school. I don't know. Let's see, how can we work that in? I mean, you've got grayer hair.
No, we can just talk about as Glenn and Paul came along, we were busier, and we mentioned our first holiday at Windermere when Glenn was just 3 months old, 4 months old.
Well, March, March, April, May, June, July. I think he was about 6 months old there when we went. March, April, May, June, July, well, maybe 4.
Yeah.
I think we were, and that was the time that Jean and Dallas and Sherry came down, and we all. That was probably our first. Let's see. Other than that, we had that famous one up at Sylvan Lake.
On Gull Lake.
At Gull Lake with Millards.
Yeah.
That was when Cam and Nikki were about a year old. And it rained.
So it must have been quite different trying to organize a holiday. I mean, just traveling would have been a lot different. Windermere would have seemed a lot further away.
Oh, that's for sure. That first trip we made out there, we wondered if I thought it was the end of the continent. We had that old green car, remember? Old green car, and John never wanted. He always wanted to go in the old green car. He didn't want to get in anybody else's car. Okay, so why don't you?
Okay. Sure.
Well, as Glenn and Paul came along, our life seemed to be a little more hectic, but in those times nothing seemed too hectic really back in the 50s, and we always managed to take one holiday a year. It may not have been that far, but we always managed a holiday. Many years ago, when there was just Cam and John, we made a trip to Gull Lake with the Millards, and I always remember we were just out of Calgary and past Airdrie, and the car died, and I thought, we're really in trouble here. But what had happened, it had a manual choke, and John had pulled out the manual choke, and the car stalled on the highway. And then a little later on, I think it was 1956, it was our first trip to Windermere. We made several trips to Windermere for holidays in the summertime, and we stayed at Lake Windermere Beach and Cabins, and had a cabin right on the beach beside the big sand hill there, and it was a beautiful spot. And we'd push Glenn down to the beach in the buggy, and he would stay in the shade while the rest of us were out on the beach. And what else?
How did you find that area? What attracted you to Windermere?
I don't know. Do you remember?
There was some. We'd met somebody out in Calgary. We'd met somebody at Millards, I think, that told us about it.
Oh, yeah.
And about this beautiful spot out in Edmonton. And Mum was living here with us then. She had sold her home and moved here to Calgary with us when Glenn was born. And so the bunch of us drove out to Windermere, and we spent 2 weeks out there. And that was our first taste of Windermere. But as Dad said, many trips later we enjoyed out there, and it was an incredible vacation. The little kids were, well, of course, Glenn was too little then to be out digging in the sand, but John and Cam and Dallas and Sherry took them, John and Cam in tow, and they were up that big sand hill, and it was just a marvelous spot. And very relaxing for all of us. But it was a big event, and like Dad said, there was many hectic times. It's not right to say that we didn't have lots of frustrating times and times when work was piled up and when chaos reigned supreme and everything, but managed to get through it. And
That didn't have anything to do with leaving 4 little boys around the house?
yeah, it probably had quite a bit to do with that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's when, you know, I mean, anybody would be foolish to say it wasn't hectic, and just as it is now when you have small children around. But I think living here in Springbank, where we do, it made it much, much more simple than living in the city, because in the first place you didn't have to worry about you kids going out and being run over on the street or getting lost, and you know, you had lots of fun chasing around out here in the woods. And there was one time I remember some boys set an anthill on fire though, and burnt a bunch of brush. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
And there are a few things like that, but we got, you know, we had this house built so it was on ground level. When we moved from the city, I said, if we don't have anything else, we're going to have the main floor on ground level so children won't be falling down the stairs, because our house in the city had steps front and back, and about 5 or 6 steps. So, you know, even the little ones as toddlers could go in and out the door without falling. Mind you, the other 3 flights of stairs had to be mastered, but Dad put railings up both sides, and you know, it all seems to have been fun now, but it was hectic at times.
What was your tact when
Tell
the
'em.
masses required discipline?
Well, I suppose when you look back on it, I remember the good times more than the bad times, which is natural, I suppose. But discipline was never a big problem as far as the boys were concerned. If I couldn't get their attention one way, well, I'd just whip off my belt and snap it to the 2 pieces together, and that was enough to send them scurrying. But discipline was never a big problem when the boys were small, that I recall.
I always remember the never-ending.
Yeah, bigger. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
that's right. That field where the barn is now, that had a lot of rocks on it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Well, that's it. You kids maybe remember more about the discipline than we do. I don't know. I had a wooden spoon I threatened. I'm not sure that I used it a lot, but well, you I think sometimes you probably should have been spanked more than you were.
When you had the property out here and decided to build a house, and obviously it was a long-term project, but it's
Yeah, okay.
And well, the very first time I remember we even thought about it. I mean, I know we'd looked and driven out here. Remember we were at Millard's, and we met Bud and Alice Van Arnhem there. And Bud Van Arnhem told you they were discussing this DVA loan. I always remember
yes.
that. That's what I think gave us a glimmer of hope that maybe we could ever build out here.
As we've mentioned earlier, we always were interested in moving out to the country, and we made several trips driving around the country looking for a suitable spot. And being a veteran, I was eligible for a veteran's loan, and it wasn't that large a loan, but it was very generous on the terms and conditions. As I recall, there was a loan of $3,000 that did not have to be paid back, and the balance of the loan, which was approximately another $3,000, was at a rate of 2.5% per annum. So although the overall amount wasn't that great, it helped us a lot when we did decide to build. And we finally bought the property in 1956, and after we purchased the property, several Sunday afternoons we came out here for picnics and had a bonfire back in the trees behind where the house is now standing. And between 1956 and 1959 we'd sit at the kitchen table and draw plans, and then we'd modify them, and then we'd modify them again, and come 1959 we had a set of plans that we had drawn up ourselves, and we had them prepared by a draftsman, and surprisingly enough the plans turned out very well. Well, the only thing we didn't do was hang the front door the right way, because we lost a few storm doors in the high winds. But 1959 was a banner year for us, and I took several months off from work to supervise the construction. I was my own contractor, and I learned a lot that year about building a house. And we weren't sure where we should build the house on the property, at the back or the front of the property, and finally, when we were about ready to build, I drove the car in through the scrub willow. There was a lot of scrub willow and poplars on the property. And I drove the car right in the midst of this area and stopped the car and got up on the roof of the car and decided where we were going to build the house and the direction it was going to be pointing. And we decided on a southwest exposure for the front of the house, and that seemed to work out well. And the first thing after that was drilling the well, and there was some people had to run into problems even then drilling wells, and it was really a red letter day when I was out at the airport and in my office at the airport, and Mum phoned me that day and it told me that the well driller had hit water at 185 feet, and we had a real good well, so that was one more problem behind us.
What was the neighborhood like here then? What was
When we first started building our house, it was quite a journey out here, really. The roads were not paved, and it would be a little too charitable to say they were good gravel roads. They were quite bumpy, and it really shook a car apart, and you didn't reach any pavement going into Calgary until you got well by the Shaganappi Golf Course. And we were one of the first peoples to move on an acreage out in this immediate area. And at that time, as we got to know the people, most of our neighbors and friends were either dairy farmers or ranchers. And we started going to the Springbank Church, and that was one of the ways we met a lot of people in the district.
I know, coming from a farm, it was probably nice, but now the situation had changed a bit. You had four kids,
Yeah,
four little kids.
Yeah.
So how did you feel about it? Did it seem remote, or did you have doubts, or how did you feel?
I never felt any qualms about living out here. I felt much more comfortable living here than in the city. I never was nervous. Again, as I say, though, Mum was here when Jack happened to be away. So I wasn't. I think if I had been all on my own with the children, it probably would. It could have been different, because you'd be nervous about somebody getting sick or something like that. But I just have always loved the country, and so we had fairly soon we had our first dog, Bingo, and we got him from we had checked into the SPCA to see if they had any dogs, and of course they had many, but they also had one that was waiting for them to have room to take this dog, and they gave us the address of this place in Calgary there where they had this dog. So we went in, and there was lovely border collie, and he was about 2 years old. And he was chained in the backyard on the clothesline. And that was his run. That was his life. So we took him, and he was just a lovely dog. We brought him here, and we let him run. And he ran and ran and ran and ran, and all of you kids ran after him, and down in the field and into the bush, and all of you yelling and afraid he was going to go and get lost or go back to town. And he just ran, and he was just a marvelous dog. He just loved you kids. You loved him, and being a 2-year-old dog, he was just perfect. And we had him I can't even remember how long we had him, but must have been 8 years later. And so once we had a dog, and then we soon had a cat, and it began to feel pretty normal out here. I must say I never ever wanted to be back in the city. Never. It was where I wanted to be, and we had that. We didn't have the house finished from the beginning. It was probably a couple of 3 years before we, had the interior finished.
It was probably 2 or 3 years before we finished the living room we're sitting in.
Yes. But we made do. Everybody shared rooms and bunk beds and all that sort of thing. And our prime thing was to we had enough bedrooms for everybody. And so, yes, I was always happy to be out here.
Obviously, you're thinking about having girls too. And, did you, how did you feel about that? Did you feel?
Well, when I was pregnant for the 5th time, I'm sure some people, are they out of their mind or whatever? And you couldn't help but hope. As I said before, my first hope was that a baby would be born healthy, and I couldn't help but hope that it was a girl. And so when Allison turned out to be a girl, it was probably quite an event for us. It really and truly was. We were just very, very happy, and the people in the community were just as happy as we were. We got cards and phone calls from everybody and telegrams from the relatives, and it was really a lot of fun because there was 2 other little girls had been born, Nancy Anderson and little Cullen girl had been born early